Welcome to Chapter 15, Supply Chain Management. This is Part A of the lecture. There will also be a Part B. This slide shows the learning objectives for this chapter on supply chain management. You may want to pause the lecture at this point and review some of the objectives for this particular chapter. Now, one comment I'd like to make before we begin this chapter on supply chain management. Supply chain management is my specialty area here at the university, and the topics that we covered in this particular chapter are all good, valid topics for supply chain management. But I want you to realize that supply chain management is much larger in scope than what is covered in this chapter. The author of your textbook has done a good job of describing supply chain management in this one chapter, but he certainly did not have the time to devote to all the aspects of supply chain management. We have courses here at the university where you can spend an entire semester studying supply chain management, and even then you will not cover everything included in that concept. We'll begin the lecture with the definition of supply chains. And supply chains are a sequence of organizations or companies, typically different companies, that are responsible for producing and delivering a product or a service to the end customer. Supply chains are sometimes referred to as value chains. Now, supply chains have been in existence for millennia. The Egyptians who built the pyramids certainly had supply chains because they had to move the blocks of materials from the quarries where they were originally cut down the Nile River to the location of the pyramid and eventually move the stones into their proper place on the pyramid. So supply chains are not anything new, but it is the management of supply chains that is the new thing. In fact, supply chain management has really only been around for about 25 years. So this is a diagram of a supply chain. This is the same diagram that we saw in Chapter 1 of this book. It shows the supply chain where we have our final customer on the final right-hand side of the supply chain, and we have each of the organizations that are responsible for taking materials and moving it to the next level. So beginning with the far left, we have supplier's supplier, who is providing materials to a supplier. That supplier is providing materials to a producer or a manufacturer who is manufacturing the product. And then that manufacturer is selling that product to a distributor. And then finally, the final customer is purchasing the product from a distributor. There are three distinct flows in a supply chain, and they're shown in the bottom of this slide. So these flows are important, and I'm going to expect you to know what they are and remember them. So the first flow is the information flow, and you'll notice that there is a line with an arrowhead on both ends of the line, indicating that information flows from the final customer. We call that the front end of the supply chain, all the way back to the back end, the supplier's supplier. And it also flows from the back end of the supply chain to the front end of the supply chain. So what information is flowing back and forth between the supply chain? Well, there's two pieces of information that is flowing in both directions. One information is demand information. So for each company in the supply chain, they have to give some demand information to their particular supplier. So what will be my demand to my supplier? The other information is supply information. So supply information in that this is the amount of material that I can supply, and this is the quantity in which that I can supply it. So supply information is flowing from the back end to the front end, and demand information is flowing from the front end to the back end. The second flow is the arrow shown in the middle, and that is the material flow. So the material flow flows from the back end of the supply chain to the front end of the supply chain. So at each level of the supply chain, the material is increased in value until it gets to a final point where your customer purchases it. And the last flow, which is the bottom arrow, is the financial flow. And the financial flow flows from the front end of the supply chain to the back end of the supply chain. So the customer pays for the product. That money is used to pay the producer, the manufacturer. The manufacturer will take that money and use it to pay their direct suppliers. And then finally, those direct suppliers will take that money and use it to pay their suppliers. So what are the facilities involved in a supply chain? Well, there's quite a few facilities. We have warehouses. Warehouses typically are responsible for keeping raw materials and components. We have factories where production of materials take place and products. We have processing centers, which could process paperwork. They could process other things as well. We have distribution centers. Distribution centers are storage locations where we typically are going to store our finished products that we would ship to our retail stores or in some cases directly to customers. And we have retail outlets as well. One thing of note is that the Dallas-Fort Worth area has been and continues to be and will continue to grow in distribution centers. We are becoming a major location for companies to want to keep their distribution centers. And the reason for that is because of our location in the United States being centrally located between the East Coast and the West Coast. Also, the availability of great transportation within DFW, with DFW Airport, as well as major interstate highways flowing through both cities, and then also the availability of rail service to be able to ship things out by rail. What this means to you as a student is that there are and will continue to be a number of very good job opportunities in the area of distribution in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So the supply chain functions and activities that take place are shown on this slide, and you'll see some things that we've already covered, and you'll see some things that we will be covering later. So there's a good deal of overlap between supply chain management and operations management. So forecasting has to be done by all the parties in the supply chain. The purchasing department function, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the inventory management, which is a critical area for all of the supply chain partners, quality management, scheduling, transportation management, delivery of the materials to the next level in the supply chain. So here's our definition of supply chain management. Supply chain management, as I said earlier, is a concept that's only been around for about 25 years. And what supply chain management is all about is trying to coordinate the various business functions across multiple companies within the supply chain and trying to integrate both the supply availability as well as the demand across the entire supply chain. With supply chain management, what we're trying to do is we're trying to plan and control not only with our customer, but even our customer's customer, and also trying to plan and control not only with our supplier, but also our supplier's supplier. So what has happened in the last 25 to 30 years is that corporations have understood that the management of our supply chains is an excellent opportunity to reduce costs, to reduce waste, and to significantly improve profitability of the company. And it is for that reason that they have chosen to invest very heavily in supply chain management, and also to provide job opportunities for those students who are interested in studying this concept. So the supply chain managers, they can come in several forms. We have positions available in companies for sourcing and procurement. There's also positions in supply managers. There's also positions in logistics, distribution managers, as well as warehouse supervisors. There are literally hundreds of positions within companies that are related to supply chain management. In fact, typically within a school year, we have more job opportunities through our career centers related to supply chain management than we have students available to fulfill those positions. So if you're not sure what you would really like to do as a career path, you may want to consider supply chain management because it offers a lot of wonderful opportunities, both financial as well as to grow personally. Some of the key issues and some of the key decisions that have to be made in supply chain management are shown on this slide here. Of course, the overall goal of supply chain management is to match supplies against demands. And that is a statement that's very easy to say, but it's very difficult to do. And the reasons why it's very difficult to do is because of the variability and also the uncertainty of both demands as well as supplies. So some of the decisions that we're trying to do in supply chain management, we're trying to determine what level of outsourcing we should have. When companies outsource, they are asking another company to perform an activity. It could be a manufacturing activity, but it could also be a non-manufacturing activity, something that they were doing themselves. They're asking another company to do that for them. So outsourcing has been a major trend that's been going on for quite a long time, and it will continue to take place. Other decisions is our procurement processes, managing our suppliers, also managing relationships with our customers. The life of a supply chain person is one of constant change. There are typically no 2 days alike in this area of supply chain management. So each day, the problems that you face will be different from the problems that you faced the previous days. And so that brings a lot of variety to the job. So if you're the kind of person who likes to have a job where things are different every day, you're not doing the same thing, supply chain management could be an area. Overall, we're trying to reduce the risk. We're trying to reduce the risk of matching supplies against demands. So here's some trends that have been taking place in supply chain management, and there's other trends besides what's shown right here. First is trying to optimize the entire supply chain from a return on investment point of view. So what works best in supply chains is when all the parties in the supply chain are profiting. if one element of the supply chain is not doing well, it's going to hurt the entire supply chain. So you've heard the old saying before that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And that's also true in supply chain. So the health of the overall supply chain is very important. Supply chains are trying to be environmentally conscious, going green, and that aspect has been going on for quite some time, especially in the area of disposal or destruction of materials. So products that are produced in supply chains, in some cases, especially electronics, there are certain components and certain elements within those products that are not necessarily healthy for the environment. They could be lead, which is not a healthy material. So how to dispose of those products after they've finished their life cycle in an environmentally friendly way. Integrating the information technology has been a major part in supply chain management, and integrating the technology of one company to another company. And then finally, adopting lean principles. And we'll talk later about lean principles, but basically, again, it is doing your job with the least amount of resources possible. Supply chains today are generally global. That is to say that at some point in the supply chain, there are going to be products that are going to be produced from low-cost countries around the world. It could be China. It could be other areas. So the management of those supply chains across international boundaries makes things quite difficult. Not only do you have time zone differences where you may have to be communicating with someone in China, and when their daylight hours are in the wee hours of the morning where you live, it makes things difficult. But also there are language difficulties that have to be overcome. There's currency difficulties. There's political difficulties. The times it takes to move these materials across these international borders is very long. So how long does it take for a ship to come from China to the United States? It takes quite a long time to get here. So being able to manage across these global boundaries is a very difficult challenge. There are a number of management responsibilities that have to be considered in supply chain management. Given that supply chains are global in nature and we're dealing with outsourcing with other countries, we have to understand the laws and the legal environment in those countries in which we're dealing with. For example, a supplier in China, there are certain legal requirements that have to be obeyed when dealing with companies in China. There's also economic issues we have to take into consideration. And there's also certain ethical issues that have to take place as well. Fairly recently, there have been some revelations regarding Walmart and Walmart's retail stores in Mexico. And it has been revealed that certain individuals employed by Walmart in Mexico were able to get the licenses necessary to build the Walmart retail stores through bribery of certain individuals in Mexico. Bribing people is an unethical behavior, and it certainly was done without the consent of the Walmart corporate headquarters. So when this came to light, this did not reflect very well on Walmart, and especially their corporate governance to be able to control individuals in foreign nations to adhere to ethical standards. From a management perspective, there are a number of strategic activities that have to be considered in supply chain management. So once again, we see this word strategic come up in our lectures. So typically when we see this word strategic, there are a few things that we should recall. We should recall that strategic decisions and strategic activities are things that are going to have a very high leverage effect on the business, either from a positive perspective or from a negative perspective. The other element of strategic is that whatever decision that we make, it is something that is not easily undone. So as we go through this, the alignment of the supply chain, what we're talking about there is the supply chain, the design of the supply chain needs to be aligned with our corporate objectives. So if our corporate objectives are to be a low-cost producer, our supply chain has to be designed such that it is going to yield a low cost. The configuration of the supply chain network, so each company in the supply chain essentially represents a node on the network. How well we use our information technology and the information technology software applications that we use is another area. Our capacity planning, our strategic partnerships that we have with our suppliers, how we go about distributing our materials across the supply chain is another factor, and just the overall management and reduction of risk and uncertainty has a great deal to do with the strategic success of the supply chain. There are also some management responsibilities from a tactical and an operational point of view. So recall that tactical things and operational things are more short-term in scope. So the impact of a decision here is not quite as dramatic as a strategic decision. So from a tactical point of view, forecasting is very critical at all levels of the supply chain, as well as sourcing and operations management. Transportation planning, being able to get materials from one location to another location in the most efficient and cost-effective way. And collaborating. So collaboration is the process of sharing information across supply chain partners. And from an operational point of view, we can see that there's a number of factors as well. Scheduling, determining the timing of when something needs to be done. Order fulfilling, so if we're fulfilling orders from distribution centers, the way we go about fulfilling those orders, the overall management of our inventory, how we share information with our suppliers as well as our customers, and overall just controlling activities. We'll move into another part of the lecture to talk about a particular function of supply chain, a very important function, but there's many other important functions besides this one, but that is procurement. So the purchasing department within a company, or we may refer to it as the procurement department, they're responsible for the purchasing of products and materials that are needed to support operations. Now, one thing that you should be aware of is that from a job opportunity point of view, purchasing is a very good entry-level position that a recently graduated student can fairly easily go into. Most companies are willing to hire buyers, is their typical title, into the procurement function and to train them in how they want them to do that. And it is a entry-level opportunity that could progress into much greater responsibilities, and with those responsibilities increasing would be a much greater financial reward. So the duties of the purchasing. One of the primary duties is to identify their sources of supply and to negotiate pricing and contracts with those suppliers. The identification of their sources of supply and the negotiating of those contracts is, in my opinion, a strategic activity. So if we do a good job in identifying our sources of supply, and we also do a good job in negotiating a win-win contract, it's important that whatever pricing we agree to, that the company that we're buying it from, they have the right and the need to have a reasonable profit as we do as well. The maintaining a database of our suppliers, and then of course from a tactical point of view, an operational point of view, once we know who the suppliers are, of giving orders to those suppliers and then receiving those supplies and having those supplies placed into our inventories. So the cycle for purchasing goes something like this. So after we're assuming, of course, we have a supplier, or we know pretty much who we're going to buy from. We receive a requisition from our operations people. The requisition essentially says we need to purchase this material, and this is the quantity of the material that we need to purchase, and usually there's a date needed. So we need this quantity on this particular date. The buyer will then look to see if we have any approved suppliers for this particular material, and if we do, he will contact that supplier or that vendor, place a purchase order with that vendor. He will monitor the order to make sure that it is in fact received, and then our receiving department will receive the order. There's another step that we could add to this particular cycle. Your textbook chooses to not add it, but I'll just throw it in because I do think it is important. After we receive the order, it is important that the supplier or the vendor is paid for the materials that they have sent us. So another step would be the payment of the vendor for the order that's been received. E-business is an extremely important activity that takes place in purchasing. So the internet and other electronic technology capabilities has allowed companies to buy and sell from each other with much ease in the last 15 to 20 years. So internet buying and selling is something that you as a student are familiar with. Buying can also take place in the form of emails. The internet can also provide information on the status of the orders and the shipping, and we can see exactly where it is. Electronic data interchange, or EDI, is a technology that does not use the internet but has been around for at least 20 years. And EDI is a very critical technology where information can be exchanged from a company's computer directly into another company's computer without the intervention of a human being having to enter in any data. So we have the speed of the internet, or the speed of electronic transfer, and we eliminate the possibility of human error in entering in data. There's a number of advantages in e-business. The first is that even a small mom-and-pop company can have a global presence. So by having a domain name and a website, your products can be available to pretty much anyone throughout the world. So it kind of levels the playing field in many ways. It also allows us to be able to have a better idea of our customers and what they're interested in. It should help us in getting our deliveries faster, and overall it should reduce our cost. Now, there could also be some difficulties with e-business, especially in the area of order fulfillment. So if you have a small business and you have a website, there's a possibility that the amount of orders that you receive could quickly overwhelm your ability to respond to those orders. So when your customers place an order over the internet, their expectation is that you should be able to deliver quickly. But if you do not have the capacity to deliver quickly, you do not have the inventories to do that, that could cause some difficulty. So this goes along with the benefits of supply chain. So for this reason, inventory management is very, very critical. This concludes part A of this chapter.